Okay, are we ready to begin? Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen again. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for those who are tuning in. My name is Brother Stephen Hernandez. I appreciate very much the invitation to present today. Today's lesson for the first in this series, which is going to be broadly about communications. And today will be the most broad. Our first lesson will be differences in communication styles. Again, my name is Stephen Hernandez. I'm presenting for the My Mental Wellness 2021 Ramadan series. So inshallah, this Ramadan has started off very well for you and your families. Just a little bit about myself. I am a Muslim of, almost 20 years now. I am a husband, a father. My primary way I probably was connected to this, beyond my family connections, is that I'm a community educator with the Family Youth Institute, which is a wonderful nonprofit which primarily does research and community education within the Muslim community. So prior to my work with them, I worked full-time as a marriage and family educator. I am not a therapist, but I do have a huge passion for work in communities of color, around communications and relationship issues. That's been a big driver of my professional and personal life. So I'm very excited to share some of the information that I'm going to today. If you would like to learn a little bit more about me, I have a YouTube channel, which is Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit Fundamentals. That YouTube channel focuses on the two great passions in my work life, which are nonprofit work, so fundraising, board development, things of that nature, and then all the relationship work that I do. So if you're curious to see a much deeper dives in some of the topics I'm going to address over the coming weeks and tonight, you can check out my YouTube channel, which is Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit Fundamentals. I have linked a playlist here in the presentation itself. I also have a podcast, which is on Anchor FM, which is called Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit and Relationship Fundamentals, where I also cover both of the topics that I addressed. So again, thank you so much for having me here as a presenter. Inshallah, I will be able to provide some interesting and helpful information. So our objective today for our first topic is to identify differences in communication styles across generations, genders, and culture to learn how they impact our relationships. And when I use the term relationships specifically today, I'm really trying to address that in the broadest possible sense. In terms of our family relationships, our romantic relationships, our friend relationships, even our work relationships. All of these are affected by how we communicate, both verbally and non-verbally. So I'm going to try to address things in a very broad sense. For those of you who can see my presentation, you'll notice the first image I have here is of a man and woman communicating with multiple flags in multiple different ways. And I felt this was a great illustration of something that I'm going to try and address throughout my talk today, which is how all these things are the generation we come from, the gender we are in and have lived our lives in, and the cultures and family of origin that we come from, how that shapes our communication. So, very specifically, where do our communication styles come from? Well, as you can see here from this picture, it's from our culture. It's from the ethnicity that our family is, the religion we practice, or at least where we come from, our family of origin, the history of our people, perhaps the specific region of the culture, of the community, of the religion that we're from. All these things help to develop our communication styles and really shape us as people. So the first thing I want to address is the culture you came from. Now, this image here, for those of you who don't know me, I am of Mexican descent. And while this image is not of my actual family, I know I have a lot of pictures like this. It's an old family album, so I thought this was a great picture to select from. So in terms of our communication styles, the first thing I want to address is the culture that we come from. So I want you all to think about, how does your culture communicate? How do you handle communication as a Mexican, right? As an Arab, as a Southeast Asian? Very broad strokes. Think about the culture that you're from. What subjects are taboo? Are there certain things that you as a Mexican, you as an Arab, would just like not talk about? How do you discuss things that are quote unquote controversial? How is money discussed in your culture, not your family yet, just your culture? How are relationships, romantic, especially relationships, discussed, if at all? How is anger handled in your culture? Like, how do you express things like that? What is the culturally appropriate way to do that? The culture that we come from really lays down the template for us in the guardrails around what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, especially around our communication. But it also informs just how we interact with the day-to-day world. The first story I want to share with you is called "What is the Name of the Donkey?" This is from my own personal experience. I visited my family's village. So my family's from Mexico. I visited the village where my father grew up and where my mother's family's from when I was about 21 or 22. And I was there to work with my grandfather, so my father's father, who was a very gruff, traditional man. And I remember we were working with the donkey because it was in the village and we were working on the farm. So we were working with this donkey every day. And I asked my grandfather, what's the name of the donkey? And he looked at me as if I was insane. Now, I can't speak Spanish very well, so my father had to serve as the translator. But he asked his father to translate my question. And then he's like, he wants to know what the name of the donkey is. And my grandfather looked at him as if, like, is your son slow? Like, is there something wrong with him? Because he's like, he doesn't have a name. His name is Donkey. Like, he is a donkey. He doesn't have a name. What did this teach me? Now, again, this is a very personal, very rural example. But in my grandfather's eyes, a donkey is not a pet or something you would name. You wouldn't name your shovel. You wouldn't name your screwdriver. A donkey was a tool, and therefore it didn't have a name. That's not something that you would do. So that taught me right there that in terms of how my grandfather saw the world was very different. How he communicated with the world was very different than I did. It was an embarrassing example, but it's one I've never forgotten. It's definitely something that I tried to think about in terms of my interaction with the older generation that I come from, because the way that they see the world, the way they interact with the world is likely very different than my own. And so I want to address a little bit of a technical issue here. 1 second. Hope everyone can see my presentation okay. So the next thing I want to address is, thank you. I appreciate the heads up there. Sorry. So again, just to recap what I was trying to show here, you should see my visuals now. So I apologize if you were not able to see that. Is, again, broad strokes, your culture tells you some basic things about how you communicate, right? What is my little story with the donkey tell me? My grandfather saw the world very differently than I would. Where, as an American, right, we communicate with our animals as pets. My grandfather saw them as tools, so he wouldn't name his shovel, right? Now, the next slide deals with your family of origin, the family that you come from. This probably more than anything else is where I'm going to spend a lot of time and really think about. I'm really going to encourage you to think about how this influenced your communication style. Now, for those of you who can see, on the right-hand side is a couple, looks like an older Arab couple. So perhaps for some of our listeners, they may be about the age of your grandparents. It's a very adorable picture. They seem to be holding on a walking stick or a cane. Their hands are touching. It's a very sweet picture. Now, I have this picture here because I like to always ask folks, Is this a picture your parents or grandparents would be comfortable taking? Why or why not? Questions to think about. How did your parents communicate? How did they verbally and non-verbally, how did they interact with one another? Who made the final decisions in the home? Islamically, there's a lot of tradition of male leadership. And so was your father the person who had again, from a communication standpoint, literally the final say? Was his word the final word? How was affection expressed? So look at this picture right here. This is a sweet picture. I can only assume that these people have been married for a long, long time. But again, this will go back to our culture and our country of origin. Was affection expressed in your home between your parents? Did you see your parents hold hands? Did they hug? Did they kiss? Was that something that you saw growing up? Did your parents or grandparents say the words to each other, "I love you," or other terms of endearment? Why or why not? And again, these are things that we tend to not think about, right? It's just what we've always known, right? This is the example that we have. So to pause on the parents for a second, I always like to ask this question for the audiences that I have, which is just, if you want to shoot it in the comments, that would be great. Maybe our moderators could let me know some of the answers, because I can't see the comments right now. Is for those of you who have siblings, let us know, how many siblings did you have? 1, 2, more than 4, more than 5, more than 10? The largest I've ever personally heard, I think, is someone had 12 siblings. I ask this question because where you are in the birth order will also determine how you were raised, right? How you were communicated to. For example, if you are the eldest daughter in, say, an Arab family or a Southeast Asian family or an Hispanic family, how you are communicated to by your parents will likely be very different if you are the youngest son, right? If you are the eldest son, what is the communication to you? Likely things like, you must set an example. You're the eldest. You have a responsibility. You need to take care of your siblings. You have to set a good example, etc., etc. Perhaps it also came with certain rules and restrictions that perhaps your younger siblings didn't have. How was love and affection expressed differently, if at all, but likely differently, between the eldest child and the youngest? How was communication handled in that way? I have often heard siblings who are much younger say that their parents let them get away with things that their elder siblings never got away with, whereas their parents may have hugged and kissed them in a way that they never did with their elder children. That's, again, these are the things that set the template for our lives, that really show us how to communicate, for good or ill. So to go back to the parents, the image we have here is something I want to address. I remember years ago, I was in college, and I just happened to overhear someone speaking with a friend of hers, and how she was very nervous to get married. And her friend was like, "Why? Like, your parents are great. Like, your parents didn't get divorced. Like, why are you worried about that?" And her friend was like, "Exactly. My parents never fought, ever. In my whole life, I never, ever heard them get upset or express any kind of anger with each other." And so for her, what seemed like a wonderful example was it was just like a mountain that she felt, or a bar she couldn't hit. It was just such, in her mind, such an unattainable example. So her parents, probably out of a really great desire to not show conflict and destructive conflict in front of their children, really kind of hamstrung her ability to see what a healthy relationship was in terms of communication, right? How your parents communicate sets the template for your life, sets the template for your ability to communicate with others, especially your romantic partners. So while we often may desire to not show conflict around our children, it actually is very important that when we do have conflict, our children see us handle it in a mature and healthy way. When we show an excess of conflict, especially destructive or toxic, uh, uh, ugly words, really bad displays of anger, perhaps throwing things, or violence of any type, or on the other end, where you never see any kind of conflict whatsoever, those two extremes are not healthy. But if your children see you handle anger, handle upset, and then come to resolutions, that's very, very important. Those kinds of communication skills are crucially important to their future development as adults. So you really need to be able to see that growing up, to be able to mimic that in your own life. So that's one of the things I really want you to think about. How did your parents communicate? How did they handle anger? When they were upset with one another, what did they do? How did they address it? Did you just wake up one day and they were so mad at each other the night before, but then you would wake up and they were fine? And did you perhaps wonder, well, what happened? Those are the kinds of things that you really need to think about. Now, again, think about it in a broader sense. When things were sad in the house, how was that communicated to you? When there was something there was a tragedy or pain that your parents were experiencing, or the family in general, were you included in that? When did you talk about finances in the home? What was the kind of conversation that was okay between adults and children? Did you have lively debates about politics and the news of the day? Were the children supposed to sit there and not talk? All these things set, again, the phrase I'm going to keep using is the template for our lives. The idea, you really have to understand that for good or ill, the example that we have growing up is the example of our lives and sets the template for us. And so we can choose to try and deviate from that, but we can only follow the example that we are born with. Now, to take this a bit further, in terms of gender expectations, how are men and women communicating to in your family? So think of yourself as a child. When you would see men and women, did you see them together? Were they always separate? When other people would come to the house, did they only communicate to your father? Perhaps only to your mother? Were there different topics that your parents were addressed to? Were your parents always together when a decision was being made? Again, that idea of who's the final decision maker. Did your parents try hard to work as a team about various problems and issues? And that gets into gender roles. And this is something I do want to spend a good amount of time on, because for good or ill, many of the people who come from maybe our first generation or even second generation, the cultures that our parents and our grandparents came from had very rigid gender roles. And there was often a reason for that. But, I'm sure all of you know or have heard in your own upbringing that, men were men and women were women, and men did this and women did this. Now, that's very difficult to maintain those things in 2021. But again, those very rigid gender rules really set up guardrails, really set up guidelines for what was acceptable behavior, what the expectations were for you as an adult, if you were a man or a woman. And then generally they set up a reasonable expectation of, well, when you want a romantic partner, these are the things to look for. And so you really want to think through, well, how were boys and girls communicated to as well, right? As those gender roles were starting to be established and developed, how were young men and how were young women, boys and girls, how were they communicated to? If you can see my image, if you can see my image right here on the lower right-hand corner, there is a young man who looks upset. He appears to be crying, and the voice bubbles around him are, Man up. Boys don't cry. Those are the kinds of things that I know young Latino men, I know myself, I heard that a lot growing up. The idea that you need to be stoic, that you don't express anger or, or pain. If you can see the other image, you see a young girl playing with a truck and a young boy playing with toys. And so, I mean, with dolls. And so again, it's that idea that certain genders should only do certain things. And so I keep hearing that I'm having issues I'm moving the slides, but the image is not changing. So hopefully what you should be seeing is gender expectations. So the presenters can let me know if the presentation has cut out with that. The thing I want to address is, again, gender expectations. So whether you can see the slide or not, the point remains, think about your upbringing. Think about how you were taught of what little girls should do, what little boys should do, and what was acceptable behavior for that or not. I'm going to refresh my screen right here because it seems to not be presenting here. Okay, so hopefully that moved the slide forward because I'm not sure why it's not moving. So think about yourself growing up. If you were a young girl, what was communicated to you? And I mean that in a very literal sense. If you were a young girl, how were you taught to speak? What were the things that you were rewarded or punished for? What was acceptable feminine behavior? For young men, what was acceptable male behavior? What were the things you could say or not say in your family? What were acceptable topics that were addressed or not addressed growing up? Those are the kinds of things that, again, set the template for our lives, right? And it's been my experience that when people had very limited interaction with the opposite sex, when it comes time for them to develop, romantic relationships, they occasionally really struggle with that because they perhaps lived in a very gender segregated environment, or they just didn't have interactions with other people, perhaps of other cultures, and they really tend to struggle with their ability to perhaps express emotion, right? So the young man here in my picture, boys don't cry, man up. Do you think that young man will have problems like emoting and really expressing himself growing up? Yeah, he likely will. And that anger is going to go somewhere. That pain is going to go somewhere. For the young people here, again, this is not a judgment call. I'm just addressing things that I have seen time and time again in the work that I do. Is that people who feel that they can't effectively communicate really becomes a struggle for them, and they really have to go back to those family examples and understand. Well, these are I can't tell you how many times I've heard something along the lines of, "Well, this is not something that we could talk about in my family. This is not something that we would ever address," or "As a young man, when I said this, I was punished for that." Or what have you. But I don't want this to be necessarily a negative thing. I really want to address that these kind of gender roles really helped us to set kind of what the examples are of how we communicate, right? And it can be funny things too, just in terms of like what slang we use, what are the turns of phrase that we use, the accent that we have. But all these things really set the template for our life and really help us understand where our communication skills, or lack thereof, come from. Now, our next slide is called The Basic Styles of Communication. And before I get into this, and I hope my slide moved forward, if someone could let me know if the slide moved forward, I would appreciate that, is I want to pause here for a second and to think about a couple questions. So we've addressed a number of really broad topics: the culture that we come from, the generation that we come from. Again, just think about how many times your parents or your grandparents have said some variation of, when I was a young person, we would never say that, or that's not how people were raised back then, which may likely be true. And that really affects how we communicate as well. But now we're starting to get a bit more into the personal. So really thinking about yourself individually, I'm going to throw back to these questions before. For everyone here who's listening to the presentation, if you could, close your eyes and just think for a second. Think about this question. What did your house, the house that you grew up in, the house that you were primarily a child in, what did that house sound like? Was it quiet? Was it loud? If it was loud, why was it loud? Was it loud because it was happy and there was a lot of laughter and singing? Were there people over all the time? Was it loud because there was a lot of conflict? There was a lot of yelling? If the house was quiet, why was it quiet? Was it quiet because everyone kind of did their own thing and there was not a real sense of like unity in the family? Was it quiet because you just came from a family of introverts, or maybe you were an only child and your parents were away a lot? Was it quiet because people couldn't communicate and there was perhaps a lot of anger and isolation amongst the members of your family? Think about that. What did your house growing up sound like? Again, think of your home growing up. How was happiness expressed? When people were happy, what did they call their other family members? Was it a party? Was it something that was held close to the chest? If I could address a story right now, and this is again goes back to our family of origin, our culture of origin, and our house growing up. My father, as I said, grew up in a small village in Mexico. Came from what we would definitely classify now as a very abusive home. But stoicism, control of emotions, these were things that were prized and valued as very important things in his culture. And a big part of how I was raised too. So I remember very clearly being a young child. Even now, I remember my dad did this maybe not even a month ago. Whenever he would watch the news or like watch a game show or anything like that, if someone got the big check or, they got the big prize on Jeopardy or, Wheel of Fortune or whatever, they got some big news and they would yell and scream and cry or faint because they were so happy. My father was always very dismissive of that. He would always say, like, why are they embarrassing themselves? Like, why do they let their emotions like just take them over? Like, what's wrong with them? He's in his 70s now. He still finds it strange and embarrassing that people would really express really strong emotion in a public way. He finds that odd. He doesn't like it. Now, do you think that has affected how I communicate my happiness, my emotions? Very much so. I'm blessed to be part of a boisterous Arab family. And I cannot tell you, much to my poor wife's cringe, I'm sure, her family often asks, like, is Steve okay? Like, he seems upset. Like, I just have, I was raised to have a very stoic, serious face. That's the default, right? You should never express an extreme of emotion, extreme of sadness, extreme of happiness. These are things to stay away from. That's not how you should communicate your emotions. I share that story because that's just how I was raised. So going forward into adulthood, I just assumed everyone acted that way. And so much like my father, when people express extreme emotions, that's something that's kind of like jarring to me because that is not how I saw emotions communicated. Now, to go back to you all who are here, think about how was anger expressed in your home? Your home. Did people throw things? Were their names called? Did people shut down? Was there a blow up, but then there was tears and hugs? How was anger expressed? How was sadness expressed, if at all? Did you know when people were upset? Were there tears? Was there anger from sadness? How were these really strong emotions expressed? How did people deal and communicate with the emotions that they had? Everyone has them, but we communicate them in very, very different ways. So to get now into the personal, ideally, and if we can think of the example of the Rasul, and praise be upon him, who perhaps one of his many qualities that we should try to emulate is that he had very assertive communication behavior. Even when someone was disrespectful to him, was rude to him, he would always communicate in a way that was respectful, that was assertive, never in a meek way, never in a shy and retiring way, but he would assert his points, and he would do it with the greatest of manners and equanimity, and just really was always someone who could assert himself in a way that was firm without being disrespectful. So that's really kind of the ideal I think we would like to reach for. But too often, and we all can do this, on the personal level, we can slip into passive aggressive behavior. So how we communicate may be, you say things that are hurtful or maybe disrespectful, but in a way that's not super clear, in a way that someone's has to think, well, did they take a shot at me? Was that someone trying to be disrespectful to me? And so we call this passive aggressive behavior, where it's you're attacking someone, but in a way that's not super clear. You have to kind of read between the lines. Another negative behavior pattern in terms of communication is aggressive behavior. And I think everyone knows someone, maybe even loves someone, or was parented by someone who always feels like, well, I have to have the last word. And those words may be angry and full of expletives. Or someone always feels like, I have to say my piece. They have to hear my opinion. I have to let them know, what they did wrong. Even to the point where it's detrimental to the conversation that you may be trying to have, or the whatever is happening in the moment, just because they feel so strongly that they have to express their opinion to the point where it can cause further conflict. And perhaps on the opposite end of aggressive too, the opposite of aggressive is passive behavior. So these may be people who really struggle to communicate. That if you ask their opinion on whether they want to get married or whether or not they want to have pineapple on their pizza, they're equally unable to answer. They really struggle to express and communicate their thoughts and desires. And they will often say yes or no. They will say yes to everything out of a desire to avoid conflict. And again, these behaviors are often modeled, for good or ill, on the things that we saw growing up, the examples that we saw in our own home. So again, I'm going to kick back to this question. What did your house growing up sound like? Was there passive aggressive behavior between the adults who raised you? Was there a lot of sniping and maybe snide remarks? Was there aggressive behavior? Was your house loud because there was a lot of screaming and yelling? There was a lot of anger that was expressed, verbally. Was there passive behavior? Did you have one parent that really dominated the other, and one of them always kind of gave in, even if they felt that they shouldn't? Was there assertive behavior? Again, this is ideal, where you saw your parents maybe have a conflict, assert their opinions, and then come to some kind of agreement. This is the ideal that we're striving for, but I think we often fall into one of the three, perhaps negative behaviors. And we're definitely going to get more into these style of communications in the next part of our series, when I really am going to share really powerful communication techniques. But I want to kind of lay the groundwork by addressing these at the personal level. So moving on, many of you, especially those who are younger, may be thinking about getting married, or maybe at that point of your life where you're starting to integrate now with your with your future in-laws, or perhaps your in-laws. And so one of the things I want to address is, when you do that, you need to be able to use open-ended questions. And again, this is where, right at the start, right, our cultures, our family of origin, our own personal foibles, that our communication of all type that comes in is filtered through all those things. So using open-ended questions, especially when you're interacting with your future in-laws or a future spouse, especially if they're from a different culture than your own, a different generation than your own is incredibly helpful. So rather than saying, "Oh, you like this or you don't like that," so you're kind of not actually asking a question really that's open ended. You're making something that's almost a declarative statement. Use open ended questions. Use careful, non-judgmental statements, and this is often very difficult when you're coming from a different culture, right? It's hard. It's easy to say things like, "Well, we would never do that," or "I think that's wrong." And again, I'm not making judgment calls here. You can all think of some examples in your own mind. We all know as Muslims what's halal and what's haram, and then there's a lot that's open to interpretation, right? So using careful, non-judgmental statements is going to be very, very difficult for you, probably personally, but it will be helpful to you as well as you're trying to kind of understand certain things or come to agreement on potential points of conflict. In general, men, when you communicate with them, may prefer a focus on direct or problem-solving talk. Got a little typo there, I apologize. On direct problem-solving talk, right? So generally, men don't like to talk about how they feel. They want to talk about the problem and get to the solution. In general, women may prefer a focus on the process rather than the outcome. So you're kind of focused more on how people feel, and you want people to feel okay to get to the solution. Generally, men want to get to the solution so then they can feel okay. Again, broad strokes, we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. Be aware and considerate of generational differences. This has been a struggle for every generation dealing with the generations before them, right? Because the older generation, right, they just don't get it. They just don't understand what we're dealing with. And everyone young thinks that up until they're not so young, and then they feel different about certain things. So be aware and considerate of generational differences. If you are perhaps in a cross-cultural relationship, or if you're communicating with someone who's from a different generation than you, it's a difficult thing, right? Let me use a personal example. So in the Latino community now, there's a rising desire amongst the younger generation generally to use the term Latinx to kind of encompass the entirety of the various Hispanic or Latino communities. My parents came from a very different generation than mine, right? They came from a time where the nationality was much more important than the ethnicity. So they consider themselves Mexicans. And so the idea that they would be Hispanic or Latino or Chicano or Latinx, these are not things, that's not how they communicate their cultural identity. They identify as Mexicans. And so this term, which in my mind is inclusive and more embracing of like the indigenous and Afro, Hispanic, a mixture of all the culture that makes up what it means to be Mexican, to me, is an alien, strange thing to my parents. So again, simple example, right? Be aware and considerate of the generational differences. My parents consider themselves Mexican because that is the generation they came from, where nationality was very important. Nationalism was very high at that time. So that's the generation that they come from. It's just, that's how they are, right? This is a skill for life. Incorporate active listening skills. And again, skills for life are often very difficult to incorporate, right? And active listening is if someone is expressing something to you, even if you disagree, you try to listen and maybe reflect back a little bit. Again, I'm getting a spoiler alert for week 2, but again, the idea is that you're trying to listen, and without right away getting defensive or firing back, you're trying to understand, like, is this what you're trying to express to me? If I heard you correctly, this is what you meant. It takes the temperature down. It really helps to address things, especially if there's a cultural difference, a gender difference, a generational difference, or all of the above. Those are the kinds of things where you pause, you take a minute to really try to understand what someone is trying to say to you is going to be very helpful. Last but certainly not least is be aware of and considerate of cultural differences. So many examples for you. Some cultures consider it rude to make eye contact. Some consider it rude to not have eye contact. Some cultures, you'll shake hands with everyone in the room. Others, you would not do that. For some cultures, you would go to the eldest person in the room first, communicate with them, speak with them first. In some cultures, the children are there all the time. Others, they're never there, etc., etc. It's not your job to judge how other people live their lives or the culture that they're from, right? Be aware and be considerate of the cultural differences that you may be experiencing for the first time or, for any time. Simple example. I think I've kind of addressed that, words of affection, displays of affection, not a big part of my culture. Living with my in-laws and going to family gatherings. It took me a bit to get used to the two kiss on the cheeks from my male in-laws, but it's something that I understand that's a way for them to express and communicate affection and brotherhood. Something I had to get used to, but something I'm definitely used to now, right? Simple example, but that was a big cultural difference. That's not something that the men in my culture do, but it is in the culture of my in-laws, something I had to get used to. So as we wind down, I want to assign a little bit of homework and kind of throw back to some of the things I addressed earlier on. I would ask everyone here in the audience to take the time to consider the following. Really think about your background and how it affects your communication. Like, think about you as a person, right? How do you handle conflict? When you need to make a presentation, when you need to communicate to your boss, when you are upset, when you're sad, how do you communicate those things? What do you feel is informing those things? Consider what changes you may want to make about how you personally communicate. And you always like to use that example of your house growing up, right? How it sounded, what the mood was like in your home. What communication skills that you grew up with, that you saw in your culture, that you saw in your family, that you saw in your home growing up, do you want to emulate? What are some things that perhaps you would like to leave behind? Consider what changes you may want to make and how you will personally try to work and grow on those things. Now, as we wind down, I hope we definitely have some questions or comments from the audience. I haven't been able to see anything just because of the screen that I have right now. So next week, inshallah, you guys are able to come back and I'm able to hopefully have two screens, so I'm able to manage this a little bit better. Thank you to Najat and your team so much. So before I get to questions, I just want to preview a little bit. The next section will be powerful communication techniques. Again, my background is as a marriage educator, so a lot of it will deal with romantic relationships or interpersonal relationships, but the communication techniques I'm going to introduce will really be great, not just for you, but with your friends, with your coworkers, with your family, communication techniques that are helpful in any kind of a situation. So as I close down my presentation, I want to open it up for questions and see if I can do that right now. Okay, I have to share again, and I hope everyone can see the screen I'm on. Okay, so I might have to, because when I had this screen right now, I can't see any questions from the audience, but I hope we have some. So yeah, I'm definitely going to need to have two screens next week. So can everyone see me okay right now? Okay, so Najat and your team, if you have questions from the audience, if you could maybe send them to me in the chat, that would be greatly appreciated, because my formal presentation time is now at an end. So again, some things to consider just as we're working through. Feel free to follow with me throughout the session of this one or next week. Think about, there's some things I would just want to address again here. think about yourself personally, right? The culture, the religion that you come from, your ethnicity, how you communicate. Think about those things. Think about how you will address your homework, right? Think about your background and how it affects your communication. And really think about that, right? Um, Maybe there's someone in your home that you grew up with that you really admired how they handled themselves. I remember a couple that I worked with. The one of the things that the wife really wanted in her spouse, and she never thought about that up until she was really starting to think of a marriage partner, was that her father was someone who was able to resolve conflict very well. And the fact that he was able to, to deal in the community, with questions on conflict in a way that was very calming and assertive was something that she really strived, that she really found herself looking for. And so when she would meet potential marriage partners, and she would see men who would get shy or get awkward around conversation or would just blow up. That was something that she did not want. And so she found herself looking for someone who could communicate in the same way that her father could. So again, that's something to think about. What are the communication styles that you really are trying to emulate, either for yourself or perhaps in a partner that you would like to mimic. And I hear that we have a question, but unfortunately I cannot see that. So I'm hoping someone can send it to me in the chat, and I'd be happy to address. I really appreciate the time here that everyone has spent. I hope this information was informative. I hope you guys can all hear me as well. I'm going to try and iron out the technical issues that I had, inshallah, for next week. But this has already been a great experience, and I appreciate it. Okay. And there we go. Okay. Our first question is, I was wondering if you could speak more about how birth order impacts how families communicated with and raised you. I think this is very relevant in our community. This is a great question. So I'm going to read it again, and I'll do my best to address it. The question is, I was wondering if you can speak more about how birth order impacts how families communicate with and raised you. So, this is a tough one because it's very, very real, right? So I guess I'll answer this with a story again, as I often do. I worked with someone once, and she was always the party planner. She was always the person who was like, does everyone have napkins? Does everyone have what they need? Does everyone have snacks? And I just asked her, are you from a big family? And she started to laugh. She's like, yes, how do you know? I'm like, well, you're always trying to take care of everyone. She was always the person who was like, oh, it's your birthday today. Here's a gift that I got you. She was always that person. And the birth order that you're in really reflects the responsibilities, for good or ill, that have been placed on you, right? If you're the eldest son, you might hear things like when you grow up, you're going to take over the family business, or as the firstborn daughter, it's your responsibility to look after your siblings. Maybe you had to discipline them. Maybe you were the one who cooked all the meals, prepared all the lunches for your younger siblings. Those kinds of things really affect your life. And so, what was that my coworker doing in a nonverbal way? She was communicating her responsibility. She was communicating her desire to take care of people, because that was what was drilled into her as a young Arab girl all of her life. So that has a huge impact in terms of how you're raised, and definitely can impact how you are looking for a potential partner or just how you communicate with the world in general. Our next question is, how can I overcome barriers to communication such as language barriers and cultural religious barriers and our generational age barriers? So I would say, hopefully, inshallah, next week's I'll be able to address that. But that's a very good question. So, in general, how can you overcome communication barriers? Is to try and step back and not let your own emotions dictate your reactions to things. That is much easier said than done, but it's a skill you have to develop. If someone's coming at you maybe very aggressively or dismissively, that is on them, and it's a reflection of their own background, right? When I was young in my career, and I was a co-executive director of an organization, and I was considerably younger than the other director. There were times when I would call a meeting, and the board of directors or other people affiliated with the organization, they would assume I was a staff person, or they would assume that I was not the person who called the meeting, and they would not look at me, and they would look at other people, and they would assume and communicate verbally and non-verbally that I was not the person who was leading the meeting. And that was very upsetting and insulting to me. But again, I had to kind of get out of my own head, where I was like, okay, they're coming from a different cultural kind of background, a different generational background, where someone who looks like me, who was as young as I was at the time, they assumed that I was not the person in charge. So I had to respectfully direct them, like, no, I'm the person who called this meeting. You need to speak to me. And that takes practice, and that takes time. Our next question is, asking on behalf of the audience, if you recognize that you have and have had for a long time a communication problem with your family and kids, let's see. If you have had a long time a communication problem with your family and kids or their kids, is it too late to fix, and where to start? A very real question. I appreciate that from the audience. Never too late to start. Does it make it harder to start? Yeah, it does. And and this is things I think we've perhaps all seen in our own life, right? In our own families, where you'll hear people say, like, well, I'm too old to change. That's just how I am. If that's your mindset, that is very difficult to overcome. If you're the person who is perhaps thinking, I communicated badly, or I made mistakes that I want to correct now, you can always take that first step. You can always try and make things better and do better. I'm not saying that's easy. It's not. But if you can really recognize there were very unhealthy communication patterns in your home, you can at first acknowledge the issues or pain that caused, and do your best to correct those things. Do your best to address the issues that were there, and try to come at that with humility and recognizing from every step of the way this is not going to be an easy issue, and you're trying to address something that maybe has been years in the making. I want to make sure I capture all the questions here. And okay, I think that's all of them now. Okay. So another question was going back to birth order. This is something again, session number 4 is to be determined. So we might want to do something on birth order. I think that could be interesting. Again, please appreciate the comments. I appreciate the questions. This definitely is helping, inform how I'm going to present this going forward. So how does birth order impact how families communicate? Immensely. It really does. And again, try to give your parents some grace. They didn't know what they were doing the first time with you. I certainly didn't with my first child. But it does affect them. Generally speaking, parents are much harder on the oldest siblings. They put a lot more responsibility on them, and that can be detrimental to the child. Many people will say, that they felt perhaps that they didn't have a childhood, that they were like, parent number 2. And some people, maybe embrace that role where they felt like they had to be the dad number 2 for their younger siblings, and perhaps they were involved in the discipline, or they set the rules that sets the template for their life. It's been my experience when I meet someone who's very assertive and very used to having their way. They were the older brother, they were the older sister, and they're the ones who set the agenda, and they were the ones who were used to getting their way, because it likely was communicated to them that it is your responsibility to set a good example. It's your responsibility to get good grades. It's your responsibility to honor the family, to not embarrass the family. Those are the kinds of things, generally speaking, that you get a lot of when you're the older sibling, the eldest sibling in the birth order. And that's something that I feel is especially prevalent in the communities that we come from. And it's definitely something that affects their lives every day. We have another question. Is there such a thing as middle child syndrome, where the middle child is neglected because they were not given as much attention as the eldest to the youngest? Now, speaking personally, as a middle child, I was often the peacemaker in my home. So, again, this is different for every family growing up. But again, I was classic middle child, where my younger sister was, according to some, was perhaps babied by my father, and my older brother was more of a discipline problem. So I often took on the role of trying to be the peacemaker between my siblings, or the family I grew up with, because there was often a lot of conflict in the home that I grew up with. So as a middle child, that tended to be the role I took on for myself, and I don't know if I had more or less interaction or time with my parents. Oftentimes, time with parents often comes in conflict too. So many people have told me how, my parents spent so much time with my older brother because he was such a problem child, and they were always disciplining him and trying to, get him in activities or do something to kind of put him on the straight and narrow. That may not have seemed like quality time, at the time, but it still is time, right? It's still time and energy that your parents gave to another sibling. So yes, middle children can often feel neglected, and that comes out in different ways. I wouldn't say that I was neglected at all, but my chosen role, which I think was perhaps unhealthy for me at times, was that my desire to try and have peace in my home meant that I was always trying to play that role as the ambassador, the peacemaker, trying to get people to get along. And that has continued throughout my life growing up, for good or ill, right? Because again, what have I been saying all night? Our culture of origin, our family of origin, house that we grew up in, sets the template for our life. So you're going to hear me say that all the time, because it's true. We can only follow the example that we've been given, and the example that we've been given, not always perfect, but it is the one that we have. It is 7 o'clock. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so it is 7 o'clock. I do appreciate so much all your questions. This was really great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your patience with my technical issues. Inshallah, this was helpful for us all. Look at this right here. Look at this. Yep. Join us for the next session, which will be Friday, inshallah, next week. Same great time, same great place. Again, my name is Stephen Hernandez with Stephen Hernandez's Nonprofit Fundamentals on YouTube. I appreciate ICD so much for having me on. I hope this was helpful. Inshallah, you guys have a great time with your families, and I look forward to speaking with you all next week at 6 p.m. Thank you.